The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. Elias Rowan read it 3 times, standing alone on the platform at Clearwater Station, while the station master pretended to sort packages he had already sorted twice. The words did not change. Regret to inform. Married another. Wish you well. 7 words. 7 words to undo 8 months of letters, of careful saving, of explaining to a 5-year-old girl that someone was coming, someone who would stay. He folded the paper once, then again. Then he put it in his coat pocket next to the photograph she had sent him, a serious-faced woman with steady eyes. And he walked back to his wagon without saying a word to anyone. His daughter was waiting at home. Winter was 6 weeks out, and the woman he had built a room for was someone else's wife by now. If this story already has you asking what you would do, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. And while you're watching, drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button too. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1888, and meet the man who had to start over from nothing. The photograph had been taken somewhere with better light than Wyoming ever offered. Elias had studied it so many times that the edges had gone soft, the corners bent from being pulled in and out of his shirt pocket through the long months of waiting. Her name was Catherine Holt, and she had written to him in a careful, even hand, letters that never said too much and never said too little. Practical letters. That was what had drawn him to her more than the photograph. Not her face, which was pleasant enough, but the way she wrote about weather and gardens, and what a kitchen needed to function properly in winter. She wrote like a woman who understood that life required doing, not dreaming. He had answered every letter within 4 days of receiving it. He was not a man who let things sit. By March of 1888, they had agreed on the arrangement. She would come by rail in mid-October. They would marry at the county courthouse in Clearwater, and she would take over management of the household that had been running on Elias's stubborn effort and very little else since his wife, Clara, died of fever 3 years prior. It was not a romantic arrangement. Both of them had said so in writing, which somehow made it feel more solid than romance. He had told Hazel in August. That had been his first mistake. Hazel was 5 years old, and she remembered her mother the way young children remember people they have lost, in fragments, in smells, in the particular way sunlight came through a bedroom window on a certain morning. She did not grieve loudly. She grieved quietly, which Elias had come to understand was actually harder to watch. A child who cried gave you something to do. A child who simply became still left you with nothing but your own helplessness. When he told Hazel that a woman named Catherine was coming to live with them, Hazel had looked up from the wooden horse she was painting, badly, with too much red, and said, "Is she going to stay?" Elias had said yes. He should have said, "I hope so." He should have said, "We'll see." He should have said almost anything other than yes, said with the certainty he did not actually possess. But he was tired, and it had been a long summer, and the word came out before he could examine it. Yes. Simple as that. Hazel had gone back to painting the horse, but that night he heard her in her room, not crying, just talking to herself in the way she did when she was working something out, and he had stood in the hallway with his hand on the door frame and thought, this had better work out. The homestead sat 12 miles north of Clearwater on land Elias had claimed under the Homestead Act in 1882. He had come out from Indiana with Clara and $40, and the kind of optimism that the frontier either sharpened into something useful or broke into something irreparable. For him it had done both at different times, sometimes on the same afternoon. The land was good land. He believed that with the confidence of a man who had staked too much on a belief to consider abandoning it. The soil held water well, and the pasture came in strong most years, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property had never fully frozen in the 6 winters he had worked here. What the land lacked was labor, and what the operation lacked, since Clara died, was organization. Elias could work from before dawn until after dark, and still feel like he was losing ground, because the house required a different kind of attention than the fields did, a sustained, daily, unglamorous attention that he could not provide while also doing everything else. Meals happened when he remembered them. Laundry happened when necessity became too pressing to ignore. The root cellar had been half-stocked when it should have been full. The preserves were fewer than they needed to be. And somewhere around July, he had run out of whatever internal resource a person uses to keep a household running and a child fed and a farm alive all at the same time. He had made it to October by will and by stubbornness, and by telling himself Catherine was coming, and then the telegram. Bob. He did not tell Hazel that night. He came home from the station and found her sitting with Mrs. Boyle from the neighboring farm, who had agreed to watch her while he made the trip to Clearwater. Mrs. Boyle was a broad woman with the face of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. She looked at Elias when he came through the door, and she read something in his face that he had not intended to show, because she quietly told Hazel she was going to check on something outside, and she left without being asked. Elias sat down across from his daughter. Hazel had the wooden horse in her hands. She carried it everywhere, that horse. And she looked at him with the particular attention that children develop when they have learned that adults sometimes deliver news that rearranges the world. "Where is she?" Hazel asked. "She's not coming," Elias said. Hazel turned the horse over in her hands. Once, twice. She didn't look up. Did she change her mind? Seems that way. "Oh." And that was all. Just oh. She put the horse down on the table and climbed down from her chair and walked to her room, and the sound of the latch clicking shut behind her was the loneliest sound Elias had heard in 3 years. He sat at the table for a long time after that, not moving, the telegram still folded in his pocket, the photograph somewhere in his coat he no longer wanted to look at. Mrs. Boyle came back inside after 20 minutes. She made coffee without being asked, set a cup in front of him, and sat down with her own. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "You need help in that house." "I know it. Winter's not going to wait on you to figure it out. I know that too." She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north the way it did in October, when it meant something, when it was not just wind but a warning about what was coming. "Post a notice," Mrs. Boyle said finally. "Not for a wife. Lord knows you've been down that road. Post for a housekeeper. Someone capable. Someone who needs work." Elias looked at his coffee cup. People'll talk. People already talk. They talked when Clara died. They talked when you started writing to women in newspapers. They'll talk if you freeze to death in February too, only then they won't be wrong. He wrote the notice 3 days later and paid to have it posted at the Clearwater station, the general store, and the church board. That last one felt like swallowing something unpleasant, but Mrs. Boyle had insisted. He kept the language plain. Capable woman wanted for household management. Rowan homestead north of Clearwater. Fair wage. Separate quarters. Situation requires someone serious about hard work. Inquire at the station. He did not mention Hazel in the notice. He wasn't sure why exactly. Maybe because listing a child felt like using her as an enticement, and something in him resisted that. Maybe because he already felt like he had let her down once in the last week, and he didn't want to make it worse. He expected nothing, or he expected the wrong kind of woman, someone desperate in a way that would create new problems instead of solving old ones. He had seen enough of the frontier to know that desperation came in different shapes, and not all of them were useful. He went back to working the farm and counting supplies, and trying to calculate whether he could make it through until spring on what he had, if he was careful. The math was not encouraging. She arrived on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the notice went up. Elias was not at the station. He had asked the station master, a careful man named Aldous, to note any women who came inquiring about the Rowan notice and to send word out to the farm. What he had not expected was for Aldous to send the woman herself, riding out on the back of the mail wagon with a worn travel bag on her lap, and something else, something larger, more awkward, roped to the back of the wagon bed. Elias was fixing a fence post when the wagon came up the track. He straightened and watched it approach, hammer still in hand. The woman climbed down before the wagon had fully stopped, which he noted without judgment. She was younger than he had expected, late 20s, maybe 30, with the kind of face that gave nothing away until it chose to. Brown hair pinned up without decoration. A coat that had been good once and was now just warm. She carried the travel bag in her left hand, and she looked at the fence post he'd been working on, then at the hammer, then at his face, in that exact order. "Mr. Rowan?" "That's right. I'm Mara Ellison. I saw your notice." He looked past her at the wagon, where Aldous was already working at the ropes on something wrapped in old burlap. What's that? A cradle, she said. It was my sister's. I couldn't leave it. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He looked at Aldous, who shrugged with the particular diplomacy of a man who had decided something was not his business. You worked a household before? Elias asked. Several, she said. Before that I worked on my father's farm in Kansas. We ran cattle and kept a large garden. I can preserve, I can butcher, I can repair most things. I can read and cipher well enough to keep accounts if you need that. Why are you looking for work this far north, this late in the season? She looked at him steadily. Because the notice was specific about wanting someone serious, and I am serious. It was not an answer to his question. He understood that she understood that. He also understood that she was not going to give him more than that right now, and he made a calculation, the kind of calculation a man makes when he does not have the luxury of time. There's a small room off the kitchen, he said. Has its own door to the outside. You'd have your privacy. That's fine. I have a daughter. She's 5. He stopped. He didn't know how to finish that sentence in a way that was both honest and not unkind to Hazel. She's had a hard few weeks, he said finally. Something in Mara Ellison's expression shifted slightly. Not softened exactly, more like it registered. I understand, she said. What? Hazel watched from the window. Elias knew because he saw her face there when he turned back toward the house. Just visible above the sill, pressed close to the glass, watching the woman who was not Catherine being helped down from the mail wagon. He kept his face neutral. He could not afford to let Hazel see whatever he was feeling, which was some complex combination of relief and wariness, and something else he didn't have a name for yet. That evening, the first meeting between Mara and Hazel was brief and imperfect. Hazel refused to come out of her room until supper, and then she sat at the table with her wooden horse in front of her like a small fortress, eating her food and not looking at the woman sitting across from her. Mara did not try to force conversation. She did not make the mistake of being too cheerful, which Elias had half feared she would do. She simply ate her supper and asked him, in a practical tone, what the morning routine typically looked like, and whether the water needed to be carried from the creek or from the well. Well, he said, but it froze solid last January. I'll start hauling extra now then, she said. Hazel looked up at that, a quick glance, barely a second, and then back down at her plate. The first week revealed things about Mara Ellison that no interview could have surfaced. She rose before Elias did, which he discovered on Wednesday when he came downstairs in the gray before dawn and found the stove already going and a pot of something on it. She had made a list, not asked him for one, simply made her own, of what the kitchen needed and what the root cellar was short of and what the mending pile had been waiting on. She handed it to him, not with any kind of criticism, but in the same way a capable person communicates a problem, plainly, without drama, expecting action. She fixed 3 things in the first week that had been broken for months. The cellar door latch, the kitchen window that had been letting cold air through a gap in the frame, the second step on the porch stairs, which had been soft and waiting to go through since August. Elias watched all of this without comment, because he did not know what to say, and because, frankly, there was too much to do to spend time narrating it. What he could not have prepared for was Hazel. By day 4, Hazel was following Mara at a distance, not speaking to her, just following, 5 steps back, sometimes 10, watching what she did. Mara did not acknowledge the following, which Elias suspected was exactly the right response. She simply went about her work and let the child orbit her in whatever way the child needed. On the morning of day 6, he came in from the barn to find Hazel standing at the kitchen table, watching Mara roll out dough, and the silence between them was different from the silence of day 1. It was not hostile. It was the silence of a child deciding whether to trust. "What are you making?" Hazel asked. "Biscuits," Mara said. "You want to cut them?" A pause. "I don't know how. I'll show you." And that was it. That was all. But Elias stood in the doorway watching his daughter be handed a tin cutter and shown how to press it into the dough, and something in his chest did a complicated thing he was not prepared for. On day 8, something happened that undid the quiet. He had ridden into Clearwater for feed, and he stopped at the post office, and there was a letter waiting, not for him but pushed into his box by some mistake, or not a mistake. It was addressed to Miss Mara Ellison, care of the Rowan homestead, and the return address was a law office in Wichita, Kansas. He did not open it. He was not that kind of man. He brought it home and set it on the table and told Mara there was a letter for her, and he went back outside to unload the feed. He did not see her read it. But that evening at supper she was quieter than usual. Not the good quiet she normally carried, but a different kind, a weighted kind. And when Hazel asked if she was sick, Mara looked at the child and said, "No, just thinking." Hazel seemed to accept this. Elias did not ask, but the letter sat on him the way things sometimes do when you know there is a door somewhere you are not supposed to open yet. October ended. November came in hard. The first real freeze hit on a Thursday night, and Elias spent most of Friday checking that everything they had prepared was actually going to hold. It was barely. The extra water Mara had laid in mattered. The mended cellar door mattered. The reorganized supply system, which meant he could actually find things without losing 20 minutes to the search, mattered. He stood in the yard that Friday evening and looked at his homestead in the last light, and made himself see it clearly, the way a man needs to occasionally see his own situation without the mercy of habit or wishful thinking. The barn was sound, the animals were fed and sheltered, the house was warm and smelled like supper, and there was a woman inside who had fixed 3 broken things in the first week and was working on a 4th. It was more than he had had a month ago, but the land speculator's letter arrived the following Monday, and everything Elias had just allowed himself to feel shifted under him like ground that was never as solid as it looked. The letter was from a man named Harlan Cook. Elias had heard of Cook the way you hear of weather, distantly, as something that happened to other people, not you. Cook had been buying up homestead claims in the territory for 2 years, mostly from families that had given out, and reselling them consolidated. The letter was written in a lawyer's language, which meant it said a great deal while committing to nothing clearly, but the meaning underneath it was plain enough. Harlan Cook believed the Rowan homestead was underimproved and insufficiently maintained under the terms of the Homestead Act, and he intended to petition the land office to have Elias's claim reviewed. Elias read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then he folded it and looked up, and Mara was standing in the kitchen doorway watching him. "Bad news?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "Man wants my land," he said. She came into the kitchen and sat down across from him, not because he had invited her to, but because she was that kind of practical. "Tell me," she said. And he did. He told her about Cook and about the Homestead Act requirements, and about what it meant to have a claim reviewed, that a man had to prove his homestead was a genuine, functioning, improved operation, not a paper claim, that a single man with a child in a struggling farm was exactly the kind of target Cook looked for. Mara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long do you have?" "His lawyer says the petition will be filed after the new year, maybe 2 months." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing but thinking. "2 months," she said. "All right." He looked at her. "All right? That's all?" "I mean, we have 2 months," she said, "so we should stop sitting here and start doing something about it." Elias had been on this land for 6 years. He had survived drought and early frost, and a winter that had killed 2 of his best cattle. He was not a man who gave up easily, but he had learned in those 6 years that there is a difference between endurance and strategy, and that endurance alone will carry you only so far before what you need is someone sitting across from you who thinks clearly under pressure. He looked at Mara Ellison across the table and thought, "I have no idea who you are or what was in that letter from Wichita." And then he thought, "But she's right. We need to start doing something." Outside, the wind was coming from the north again. Hazel was in her room talking to her wooden horse, working something out in that quiet way she did. The cedar cradle sat in the corner of the kitchen where Mara had put it, carefully, against the wall, out of the way, but not hidden. Elias did not know yet what the cradle meant. He did not know what the letter from Wichita meant. He did not know, sitting at that table in November of 1888, how much was still coming at him. But for the first time in a long time, he was not sitting alone when it did. The letter from Wichita sat on the kitchen shelf for 3 days before Mara touched it again. Elias noticed. He noticed because he was the kind of man who watched things without appearing to, a habit built from years of reading weather and soil and animal behavior, all of which required the same skill, paying attention to what wasn't being said. The letter leaned against the wall behind the flour tin, and every time Mara passed it, she didn't look at it, which told him she was thinking about it constantly. He didn't ask. He had enough of his own trouble to carry without picking up someone else's before he was invited to. The trouble with Harlan Cook was not abstract. Elias had made some inquiries in Clearwater, casual ones, the kind you make by asking a question sideways to someone who knows the territory, and what came back was not reassuring. Cook was not a man who bluffed. He had filed 4 land review petitions in the past 18 months and won 3 of them. The 4th had failed only because the homesteader in question had a brother-in-law who was a county commissioner, and even that had taken 5 months and more money in legal fees than the land was worth. Elias had no brother-in-law. He had $12 in savings, a half-stocked cellar, and a housekeeper he had known for 11 days. He told himself he was not panicking. He was assessing. There was a difference. On the 4th day, he came in from checking the cattle to find Mara at the kitchen table with the Wichita letter open in front of her and a piece of paper beside it where she had been writing something. She looked up when he came in, and she didn't try to hide either the letter or the paper, which he appreciated. "I'm not going to ask," he said, pulling off his coat. "I know," she said, "but I'm going to tell you anyway, because it's going to affect your situation, and you have a right to know." He sat down, waited. She folded her hands on top of the letter. Her knuckles were chapped from the cold water and the washing, and she had a small burn on her left wrist from the stove that she hadn't mentioned and he had only noticed by accident. She was not a woman who reported her own discomforts. "My sister died in April," she said. "Her name was Ruth. She was 26. I'm sorry. Her husband, her widower, is contesting her estate. There wasn't much. A house in Wichita, some furniture, the Cradle." She paused. "He says I took the Cradle without permission. He wants it back, or he wants me charged with theft." Elias looked at her. "Did you take it without permission?" "I took it the night of her funeral, from a house where her husband had already moved another woman's belongings into the bedroom. She said it without heat, just fact. So yes, technically." "What does the lawyer say?" "That I should return it and let the matter drop. That it isn't worth the fight. But you brought it all the way to Wyoming." She looked at him steadily. "Ruth made that Cradle. She and her husband built it together in the first year of their marriage, before things went wrong between them. She told me once it was the only thing he ever made with his hands that wasn't for show." A pause. "She never got to use it. She lost the baby in February. Died herself in April." Another pause, shorter. "I wasn't leaving it for him." Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Cradle in the corner. He had not looked at it directly since the day it arrived. There was something about it that discouraged casual attention. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Nothing right now," she said. "I can't afford a lawyer and I can't go back to Wichita, and he knows both those things. He's making noise to make noise. What I need to do is work and stay employed long enough to have something to stand on." She picked up the letter and folded it, not roughly, but with finality. "I'm telling you because if someone shows up here looking for me, you should know why. And because you didn't want me thinking you were hiding something." She looked at him with a slight shift in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like reassessment. "Yes," she said. "That too." He nodded. He got up and poured himself coffee. He poured a second cup and set it in front of her without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up. "The Cook situation," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said, about having 2 months. And I need someone who knows how to document things. Improvements, supplies, operations. Something a land review examiner would actually look at and take seriously." Mara was quiet for a moment, the coffee cup held in both hands. "You need an inventory," she said. "Just a list. A real record. Dates, quantities, condition. Signed, if possible, by people who've been here and seen it. You've done something like that before." It wasn't a question. She didn't treat it like one. "My father had a dispute with a neighbor over a water right. I was 17. I spent 6 weeks documenting every improvement we'd made to that irrigation channel going back 8 years. We won." Elias looked at her across the table. He had spent 11 days watching this woman work without complaint, fix things without being asked, and navigate a grieving child with more patience than most people manage with adults. And now she was sitting here telling him she had won a legal dispute at 17 by writing things down carefully. "All right," he said. "Let's start tomorrow. Ots." What followed was not tidy. Nothing about that winter was tidy. They divided the work the way people divide things when there is too much of it, not by preference but by necessity. Elias covered the outdoor operations, the barn, the fencing, the cattle, the firewood. Mara ran the household and began the inventory, moving through the property with a notebook and a pencil, recording everything in a hand that was precise without being ornamental. She dated each entry. She noted conditions. When something had been repaired, she wrote when and how. When supplies were laid in, she wrote quantities and estimated values. She also asked Elias questions that he initially found uncomfortable, not because they were prying, but because they required him to know things he had been imprecise about. How many cords of wood? He had to go count. How many head of cattle, and in what condition? He had to think carefully. How much flour, cornmeal, salt? She went to the cellar herself and counted. "You're worse at knowing what you have than I expected," she said one evening. Not unkindly, just as a fact. "I know what I have," he said, more defensive than he intended. "You know it approximately." She tapped the notebook. Approximately doesn't win land reviews. He didn't argue because she was right, and he was practical enough to accept being right when it cost him something. Hazel began appearing at the kitchen table during the inventory sessions. She would sit with her horse and her small collection of rocks and listen to the back and forth between them without contributing anything, but Elias could see her tracking the conversation, the small movements of her eyes, the way she would go still when something seemed important. She was a listener, his daughter, had been since before she could talk. One evening she said, out of nowhere, "Mara, what does cellar mean?" "Where we keep food so it stays cold and doesn't spoil," Mara said, not looking up from the notebook. "We have one? You didn't know that? Papa never let me go down there." Elias opened his mouth. Mara glanced at him, barely a glance, but enough, and then said to Hazel, "It's dark and the steps are steep, but you could come look sometime if your father says so." Hazel turned to Elias. The expression on her face was familiar. She was not exactly asking for permission. She was presenting him with the expectation that permission was forthcoming, and he should recognize that and behave accordingly. She had learned this expression from Clara, which sometimes made it hard to refuse. "Fine," he said, "with Mara. Not alone." Hazel turned back to her rocks, satisfied. It was such a small thing. It was such a tremendous thing. He had to look out the window for a moment because he didn't want either of them to see whatever had happened to his face. The second week of November brought snow, and with the snow came a visitor Elias had not prepared for. Harlan Cook did not come himself. Of course he didn't. Men like Cook did not make early appearances in person, because appearing in person was a form of commitment, and commitment was what they used other people for. He sent instead a man named Dent. No first name offered, none asked. Dent arrived on horseback in the early afternoon, wearing a coat that was too good for the weather and an expression that was professionally neutral, which was its own kind of hostile. Elias met him in the yard. He did not invite him inside. The cold was the message he intended. "Mr. Rowan," Dent said, "Mr. Cook asked me to follow up on his correspondence. I got his letter. He's interested in whether you've given any thought to a negotiated settlement. He's prepared to be generous." "I'm not interested in a settlement." Dent produced a small leather folder. He opened it with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before and had gotten what he came for, most times. "Mr. Cook's surveyor has completed an assessment of this property, based on improvements made since the original filing." "I'd like to see that assessment," Elias said. "It's a preliminary." "Then I'd like to see the preliminary." Dent hesitated, the first hesitation, and Elias noted it, and then handed over 2 pages of neat typewritten text. Elias read them. He was a slow reader, but a careful one, and he made himself go through every line while Dent stood in the snow waiting. The document was as dishonest as it was professional. It acknowledged improvements but characterized them as insufficient. Fencing described as partial and poorly maintained, the house as marginally habitable by permanent family standards. The operation as consistent with a bachelor claim rather than an established homestead. It was all technically arguable, which was the point. It did not need to be provably true. It needed to be arguable enough that a land review examiner would take the question seriously. This is wrong on 4 specific counts, Elias said, handing it back. You're welcome to submit your own documentation, Dent said. I intend to. Mr. Cook's petition will still be filed after the new year. The timeline doesn't change based on... I know the timeline. Elias looked at him. Tell Cook I've been on this land 6 years. I intend to be on it 6 more. Dent folded the document back into his folder. His expression had not changed, but something in his posture had shifted slightly. I'll pass that along, he said. And then he left, which was almost the worst part. The ease of it, the efficiency, like this was simply one stop on a longer route. Elias stood in the yard after the horse was out of sight, and he breathed steadily through his nose for about 30 seconds, which was what he did when he was furious and needed to not be. Then he went inside. Mara was standing in the kitchen. She had heard the conversation through the window. He knew because the window was cracked an inch, and she was not someone who stood near a cracked window in winter by accident. She did not pretend otherwise. How bad? She asked. He told her about the assessment. He told her what it said and how it was worded. She listened with the focused expression she used when she was building something in her mind. He's not wrong that it was a bachelor claim, Elias said. Before you came. I was barely holding it together. Before I came, it was a bachelor claim, she said. Now it isn't. The question is whether we can prove it. Can we? She looked at the notebook on the table. They had 10 days of inventory entries. Solid ones, dated, detailed. But 10 days was not the same as an established household, and both of them knew it. We need neighbors to speak to what they've seen, she said. Not just what we write down. People who've been here, who can say what this place looked like and what it looks like now. Mrs. Boyle. Yes. Who else? He thought. Tom Greer, south of us. He helped me with the barn roof in September. Alistair Crane from the feed store. He's seen me every month for 6 years. Could speak to continuity if nothing else. Get them here before the snow gets worse, she said. Not to testify yet. Just to come, see the place, see Hazel, see that there's a functioning household, so that when the time comes they have something recent to speak to. It was clear thinking. He appreciated that she did it without drama, that she did not treat the situation as an occasion for despair or for false reassurance. She treated it as a problem, and problems had steps. There's something else, he said. She waited. Dent's assessment. It referred to this as a bachelor claim, meaning a man living alone. He looked at her carefully. It didn't mention you, meaning Cook's surveyor hasn't been here recently enough to know I'm here, or he's choosing not to mention it yet, saving it to argue later that a temporary employee doesn't constitute a household. Mara was quiet for a moment. He watched her work through it, not the way someone works through something frightening, but the way someone works through something tactical. He's not wrong that a housekeeper alone wouldn't be enough, she said. The act is about family operations. A man paying wages to a woman who might leave in spring isn't the same as a family. Elias looked at the table. No, he said. It isn't. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something they both see, but neither is ready to name. Hazel's voice came from the other room, talking to her horse about something in the serious, instructional tone she used when she was explaining the world to it. Both of them heard it. Neither of them looked toward the sound, but both of them changed slightly. Some subtle adjustment in the shoulders, the hands, the weight of the moment. I'm going to ride to Mrs. Boyle's tomorrow, Elias said. Ask her to come by the end of the week. I'll have the inventory updated by then, Mara said, and I want to go through every piece of mending I've done since I arrived. Every repaired garment, dated, every meal put up, every jar sealed. It needs to be a record of a household, not just a farm. You've been keeping that? I keep track of things, she said simply. It's how I work. He nodded. He went to pour more coffee and found the pot empty, and he refilled it from the water barrel without being asked. Mara noticed, he could tell by the brief pause in whatever she had started writing. And she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and the stove ticked against the cold outside, and that was that. Mrs. Boyle came Thursday. She was not a woman who required explanation or persuasion. Elias had ridden to her farm Wednesday morning and told her what was happening. Cook, the petition, the assessment, the timeline. And she had listened with her arms crossed and her eyes narrow and then said, That man already tried this with the Flemings 2 years back. Should have been stopped then. And Elias had said, Will you come by Friday, see the place? And she had said, I'll come Thursday. I'm busy Friday. She arrived in the early afternoon with her husband, who was a big quiet man named Georg, who had broken his English but kept it running through determination and goodwill. Georg looked at the repaired porch step, said something approving in German, and immediately went to find Elias in the barn to discuss it. Mrs. Boyle came inside. She stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Elias had seen her stop in that doorway before. When Clara was alive, that doorway had always led to a warm, organized kitchen, and when Clara died, it had led to something that was technically still a kitchen, but felt like organized grief. He had seen Mrs. Boyle's face in that doorway in the months after, and it had not been easy to watch. She stopped now and looked around, and Mara was at the table with Hazel, who was helping, approximately, to sort through a pile of dried herbs that Mara had hung in October and was now portioning into jars. Hazel had more herbs on herself than in the jars, but she was concentrating with tremendous seriousness. Mrs. Boyle looked at the jars lined up on the shelf. She looked at the repaired window frame. She looked at the stack of mended clothes folded on the chair by the door, waiting to go back to the rooms they belonged to. And her expression did something complex and quick that she covered before Hazel could see it. She sat down. Mara poured coffee. "You're Mara," Mrs. Boyle said. "Not a question." "Yes, ma'am. Elias wrote to me about the notice. I told him to post it." She picked up the coffee. "He didn't tell me you'd have the place looking like this in 3 weeks." "It had good bones," Mara said. "Just needed some attention." Mrs. Boyle glanced at her sideways, over the cup. "Where are you from?" "Kansas. Abilene, mostly." "Family?" A slight pause. "A father and a brother, still there. My sister passed in April." Mrs. Boyle said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry," simple and real, the way she said most things. "Thank you." Hazel held up a jar with approximately 4 sprigs of thyme in it. "Is this full?" she asked Mara. "Not even close. It looks full. It looks like you put 4 pieces of thyme in a jar." Hazel looked at the jar with some indignation. "There are 5. Then add 20 more." Hazel made the face of someone being treated unreasonably, which was her second most common expression after the one where she was waiting for permission she had already decided she was going to get. She went back to the herbs. Mrs. Boyle watched this exchange with the neutrality of a woman determining something she was not yet ready to say. Then she turned back to Mara. "You know about the cook business?" "Yes." "What do you think?" "I think the inventory will be strong," Mara said. "I think neighbor testimony will be important. And I think the legal argument comes down to whether a household constitutes a family operation or whether family is defined by marriage specifically." Mrs. Boyle looked at her for a moment. "You're not a fool." "No." "Good." She drank her coffee. "Because Cook's not either. He's been patient with this particular property. He wanted it 2 years ago, and he waited. He's waiting for the right moment to move, and I think your arrival here is what made him decide the moment was now." Mara looked at her. "My arrival?" "Word travels," Mrs. Boyle said, not unkindly. "People saw the notice. People know a woman came, and Cook, or someone working for him, probably figured that a desperate man who posted a notice for a housekeeper 3 weeks before winter is not the stable household the Homestead Act envisions." She set down her cup. "He's not wrong, by the letter of the thing. He's just wrong about where you're heading." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, Elias and Georg could be heard through the wall, their voices muffled by the barn boards, talking in the companionable low register that men use when they are looking at something together and deciding what it needs. Hazel had gone very still, which meant she was listening. "Mara," she said, without looking up from the herbs. "Hmm? What's a household? A place where people live and take care of each other." Hazel considered this. "Are we a household?" Mara looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said. "We are." Hazel went back to counting thyme sprigs, satisfied. Mrs. Boyle looked at the table and then at her coffee cup, and then out the window, and her expression was the careful expression of someone keeping several things to themselves out of respect for a situation that had not yet finished becoming what it was going to be. The second large trouble came from a direction Elias had not anticipated. He had gone into Clearwater the following Monday for supplies, the kind of trip that took most of the day when the roads were snow-packed and the wagon needed careful handling. He left Mara with the list, the money, and Hazel, in that order of complexity. He came back to find the money on the table, the supplies not yet organized, and Mara sitting across from a man he did not recognize. The man was perhaps 40, well-dressed for this part of the territory, with the kind of patience in his posture that comes from being accustomed to waiting people out. He had a hat on the table beside him, as though he had been raised to remove it indoors, and a leather satchel on the floor beside his chair. Hazel was in her room. The door was shut. Elias came in from the cold and looked at the man and looked at Mara, and Mara looked back at him with a steadiness that said, "I am all right, but stay sharp." "This is Mr. Elias Rowan," she said to the man. And to Elias, "This is Mr. Harold Fitch. He's a representative of my brother-in-law's estate attorney." Elias understood immediately. He closed the door behind him. Fitch stood and offered a hand. Elias shook it once, briefly, and sat down at the head of the table without invitation, because it was his table, and he was not going to stand in his own kitchen. "Mr. Rowan," Fitch said, "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I've been told Miss Ellison is employed here. She is. I'm here to formalize the request on behalf of my client, Mr. Theodore Marsh, that the item taken from his wife's estate in Wichita." "Her sister's estate," Elias said. Fitch paused. "The late Mrs. Ruth Marsh's estate, yes, under Kansas inheritance law." "We're in Wyoming." "Yes, but the item was removed from a Kansas property, which establishes—" "Mr. Fitch." Elias kept his voice level. "I don't know the law on this. Neither does Miss Ellison, probably. What I know is that you've come to my home unannounced to speak to a woman I employ about property that she holds. If Mr. Marsh wants to pursue a legal claim, he can do it through proper channels. What he can't do is send someone to my house to pressure a woman who works for me." He looked at him evenly. "We clear?" Fitch was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who was frequently spoken to this way. That was clear from the slight recalibration happening behind his eyes. He looked at Mara. "Miss Ellison, my client is prepared to withdraw the matter entirely if the item is returned. No charges, no further correspondence." Mara looked at him across the table. She had not said a word since Elias sat down, and now she said, "No." Fitch looked at her. "The item has limited monetary value." "I know its value," she said. "The answer is no." Another pause. Then Fitch picked up his hat and his satchel with the smoothness of someone who had not won but had completed a required step. "I'll be in Clearwater through Wednesday," he said, "if you change your mind." Elias stood, which was the signal that the man should leave, and the man left. The sound of the horse outside diminishing toward the road was the only sound for a moment. Then Elias sat back down. "You all right?" he asked. "He's been here for 40 minutes," she said, and something in her voice that had been held very tightly released just slightly. Not collapse. Just the half-second evidence of what it costs to sit across from a man like that for 40 minutes and not move. "He's not going to get it." "No." She looked at the cradle. "He's not. Does Marsh know where you are now?" "He knows I'm somewhere in Wyoming, north of Clearwater. I wrote to my brother back in Kansas and mentioned the town. I should have been more careful." She folded her hands on the table. They were steady. She made them steady, and he could see the effort of it. "I'm sorry he came here. I didn't anticipate it happening this quickly." "Don't apologize," Elias said. "You didn't bring him." "He came." She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief. Something more complicated than either. The look of a person who has been defending themselves alone for long enough that they have stopped expecting anyone to stand next to them when they do it. Hazel's door opened. She came out with the wooden horse and looked at both of them. "Is he gone?" she asked. "Yes," Mara said. "He was talking too loud," Hazel said. "He was." "I don't like him." "You're not required to," Mara said. Hazel looked at her seriously. Then she climbed up into the chair next to her and set the horse on the table. "Tell me about the herbs again," she said, "the kind that's good for headaches." Mara looked at the child for a moment. Something shifted in her face, too fast to name, and she didn't let it stay long. Then she pulled the jar of dried lavender toward them and began quietly to explain. Elias watched them for a few seconds. Then he got up and went to see about supper, because that was the thing he could do, and he did it without being asked, and outside the snow fell soft and steady against the windows, and the homestead held. Fitch left a particular kind of residue behind him, the way certain visitors do. Not damage exactly, but a disturbance in the air that took longer to settle than the sound of the horse fading down the road. Elias felt it through supper and into the evening, a low-grade alertness that he recognized from the years when the farm had been genuinely close to failing, when every unexpected arrival carried the potential to be the thing that finally tipped the balance. He was washing the supper dishes, a task he had resumed without discussion sometime in the second week, on the grounds that Mara cooked and it seemed unreasonable for the same person to also clean up after, when she came into the kitchen from checking on Hazel. She leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms, not in a defensive way, but in the way of someone who has been holding something and is now deciding whether to put it down. "He'll come back," she said. "Fitch. Or someone like him." "Probably. I need you to understand something." She paused, choosing the words with the care she brought to all precise things. "Whatever Marsh does, I'm not giving that cradle back. I want to be honest with you about that because it might cause trouble for this place, and you should know it going in." Elias set down the dish he was holding and turned to look at her. "I figured that out when you told him no. I mean legally. He could escalate. Could he get it? Legally? I don't know. Possibly. Kansas law, Wyoming jurisdiction. I don't know how it would work." She looked at the cradle. "But I need you to know that I won't fold on it, so if having me here creates that risk for you—" "Mara." He said her name the way he said things when he was done discussing them. "I told a man to leave my house today. That's where I stand." She looked at him for a moment. Then she unfolded her arms and sat down at the table, and something in the set of her shoulders changed. Not relaxed, because she was not someone who fully relaxed, but adjusted, the way a person adjusts when they have been carrying a weight at a bad angle and finally shift it to a better one. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Tell me if there's more I should know." She looked at the table. "There might be. I'll tell you when I know it myself." It was not a perfect answer. He accepted it because it was an honest one. "What?" December arrived with the particular commitment of a Wyoming winter that intends to be taken seriously. The temperature dropped below zero on the third day and stayed there, and the work of keeping everything alive, the cattle, the pipes where they could freeze, the house's heat, the child who had developed a cough that Elias watched with the specific anxiety of a man who had already lost one person to something that started as a cough, became the entire shape of their days. Hazel's cough was not serious. Mara assessed this with a practicality that Elias found both relieving and somewhat startling. She felt Hazel's forehead, listened to her chest in the manner of someone who had done this before, had her open her mouth, and then prescribed willow bark tea and 2 extra blankets and said she could still get up and move around but should stay inside. Hazel objected to the staying inside. Mara told her the cold didn't care about her objections. Hazel told Mara that was unfair. Mara said yes, it was. "How do you know she's not really sick?" Elias asked that evening quietly, so Hazel couldn't hear from her room. "Because her color is good, and her breathing is clear, and she's arguing with me," Mara said. "Sick children stop arguing. You've nursed sick children before." "My sister was sick a great deal when we were young." She said it simply, then moved on without ceremony. "I'll watch her through the week. If the cough gets worse or she develops a fever, we send for the doctor in Clearwater." He trusted her assessment. He was not entirely sure when that had happened, the trusting, but it was there, settled and workable, like a post that had been correctly set and had taken hold in the ground. The inventory was now 47 pages. Mara had begun organizing it into sections, with dates and categories that she explained to him over supper in the efficient manner of someone briefing a partner. She had written to Tom Greer and Alistair Crane, asking if they would be willing to sign statements about the property, and both had agreed. Mrs. Boyle had already written a statement on her own initiative, 2 pages in her blunt, unsentimental hand that covered 6 years of observations about the Rowan farm, and arrived with no accompanying note, just the pages and her signature. Elias read Mrs. Boyle's statement twice. He had to put it down after the first reading and go outside for a few minutes. It was not a sentimental document. Mrs. Boyle was not a sentimental woman. But she wrote about what she had seen with the plainness of someone who had watched it over time, and there were things in there that he had not known she was paying attention to. The winter Clara died. The spring after, when he had kept the farm going by some combination of stubbornness and the inability to think of an alternative. The gradual steadying over the years since. And then, in the final paragraph, a description of the current state of the household that was specific and fair and more generous than he deserved, which was exactly what made it hard to read. He came back inside and Mara was at the table with the inventory, and she looked at him briefly and then back at her papers, and she did not ask where he had been, which was the right thing not to ask. The third week of December brought two things in close succession that changed the shape of what was coming. The first was a letter from the land office in Cheyenne. It was addressed to Elias, and it confirmed that a review petition had been filed against his claim by a party represented by the law firm of Whitmore and Slade, Cook's attorneys. The review was scheduled for the 14th of February. They would be expected to present evidence of a functioning, improved homestead operation meeting the standards of the original act. The examiner assigned to the case was a man named Reginald Albright, about whom the letter said nothing useful. February 14th was 8 weeks away. Elias read the letter at the kitchen table with Mara across from him, and he went through the thing twice and then set it down and looked at the window where the frost had crept halfway up the glass. 8 weeks, he said. It's enough, she said. Is it? It has to be, so yes. She pulled the letter toward her and read it herself carefully. Albright, do you know that name? No, I want to find out about him. Who he is, how he runs these reviews, what he weighs. She tapped the letter. A review is not a court case, it's an examination. The examiner has discretion. That means his character matters. How do we find that out? Mrs. Boyle might know, or Crane at the feed store. He talks to people from all over the territory. She looked up. Can you go into Clearwater before the week's out? Weather permitting, go. She wrote Albright in the margin of her notebook, underlined it, and asked Crane if he knows anything about Whitmore and Slade. I want to know who Cook's lawyers are and how they've handled these reviews before. He looked at her across the table. She had the particular focus she got when the problem had become concrete, when it was no longer a general threat but a specific thing with a date and a name, something that could be examined and prepared for. He had come to recognize that focus. It was the most reliable thing about her, that quality of meeting the actual problem rather than the fear of it. You've been preparing for this since the day Cook's letter arrived, he said. She didn't look up from the notebook. Yes, even before I asked you to. A pause. I could see where it was going. She wrote something. I also figured that if this place went under, I'd need to find different work, so it was in my interest. It was the kind of answer she gave when a more honest answer felt like too much to offer. He let it stand. He understood about keeping the more honest thing back until you were sure of the ground you were standing on. Well, the second thing that happened in the third week of December was smaller in scale and larger in consequence, in the way that the most important things often are. Hazel's cough had cleared. She had been back on her feet for 4 days, moving through the house with the restored energy of a child who had been still longer than she wanted and was making up for it. She had decided, apparently, that Mara's kitchen was now also her kitchen, and she inserted herself into the cooking process with the combination of genuine enthusiasm and catastrophic imprecision that characterized most of what Hazel did. She had spilled flour twice, broken a jar she was reaching for and was not supposed to be reaching for, and somehow gotten molasses on the wall in a location that neither Elias nor Mara could explain. But she was persistent in the specific way that children are persistent when they sense they are learning something real, and Mara had the patience for it. Not the performed patience of someone enduring a child, but the actual patience of someone who found the child genuinely interesting. On the Thursday evening of that week, Elias came in from the barn to find supper already on the table and Hazel in her chair with the particular expression of someone who had done something and was waiting to find out if they were in trouble for it. On the table, beside the bread and the soup, was a small flat thing wrapped in a piece of cloth. What's that? Elias asked, sitting down. Hazel made it, Mara said, from the stove, her back to them. Her voice was neutral, in the deliberate way of someone who has decided not to interfere with what is about to happen. Hazel pushed the cloth-wrapped thing toward him. It's for you, she said. I made it today. Mara helped with the hard parts, but I did the rest. He picked it up. It was a small flat piece of wood, sanded smooth, mostly, with a few rough patches that had been made by a 5-year-old hand and showed it, and burned into the surface, unevenly but legibly, were the letters. Home. He looked at it for a long moment. Mara has a burning tool, Hazel explained, in the tone of someone providing useful information. It was in her bag. She let me use it. I did the H and the E and the M. The O is a little big. A pause. I know it's a little big. I was trying hard. The O is fine, Elias said. It's bigger than the other letters. It is. It's still fine. Hazel seemed to decide to accept this. Mara said I could give it to you. I wanted to give it to you. She picked up her spoon and looked at her soup and said, in the offhand way of children who are saying important things, because this is our home, all three of us. I decided. Elias looked at the piece of wood in his hands. He looked at the letters, uneven and real. He looked at the O, which was indeed larger than the other letters, and he thought about how Hazel had been still and quiet for so many months, and how she was not still now, and he did not trust himself to speak for a moment. Mara came to the table and sat down and picked up her spoon and said to Hazel, "Did you tell him about the rough patch on the back?" "I sanded it," Hazel said, defensive. "You sanded most of it. The rough part is small. Show your father the rough part." Hazel showed him the rough part, which was on the lower right corner, and was indeed small, and the showing of the rough part was what allowed him to collect himself. And by the time they were done examining the small rough patch, he was capable of eating supper without his face doing anything that required explanation. He propped the piece of wood against the lamp on the table, where it stayed through supper, and after, and where he found it still standing the next morning when he came down before dawn to start the stove. On a Saturday in the last week of December, Ilias asked Mara to walk the property with him. It was a clear day, cold but calm, with the kind of winter light that made the snow look deliberate. He had asked Mrs. Boyle to sit with Hazel for the afternoon, which Mrs. Boyle had agreed to with the specific neutrality of someone who had several thoughts about the situation and had decided to keep them to herself. They walked the fence line first, because that was practical. He wanted her to see what the inventory described, to have the physical reality of it in her mind before the review. She had documented it in writing, but writing and walking are different kinds of knowing. She had her notebook. She made additional notes as they went, small corrections and additions, crouching in the snow at one point to look more closely at a post repair that she wanted to describe with more precision. He showed her the creek and the point where it had come close to flooding in the wet spring 3 years back, and how he had built up the bank afterward. He showed her the section of pasture that had the best grass and the section that needed work. He showed her where Clara had planted a kitchen garden the first year, and where he had kept it going in the years since, imperfectly, because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be kept going. Mara listened and wrote and asked questions that were specific and intelligent and showed she had been thinking about the land itself, not just the documents that described it. They were walking back toward the house, the light starting to angle lower in the December way, when he said, "There's something I need to ask you." She slowed her pace slightly. "All right." He had thought about how to say this for a week. He had thought about it in the barn, and during the fence repairs, and in the early mornings before she was up. He had turned it over enough that he was confident in the reasoning and not at all confident in the asking. "The review is about whether this is a functioning family homestead," he said. "The inventory is strong. The neighbor statements are strong. But Cook's lawyers are going to argue that a man and a hired housekeeper isn't a family, and they're not wrong. The act was written with family in mind." Mara said nothing. She kept walking. "A marriage would change the legal status of the claim," he said. "A wife isn't an employee. A wife is a stake in the land. It's different in the eyes of the law. I know that. I'm not—" He stopped. He made himself start again. "I'm not asking the way a man asks a woman because he has feelings he wants to act on. I want to be honest about that because you deserve honesty. I'm asking because it would strengthen the case, and because I think we work well together, and because Hazel—" He stopped again. "Hazel has decided," he said. "I heard what she said at supper. You heard it too." Mara had stopped walking. They were standing in the snow about 30 yards from the house, the light pale and even around them. She was looking out across the pasture, not at him. "You're asking me to marry you for your land case," she said. "I'm asking you to consider it, and to know that if you say yes, I will keep my word about everything that means." Separate. The arrangements stay however you want them. You'd have a legal stake in the property. You'd have standing that Fitch and Marsh couldn't challenge. He paused. "It's not nothing. For you, I mean. It's not a nothing arrangement." She was quiet for a long moment, The cold moved between them without hostility. I have things you don't know about, she said finally. I know. Things that might become problems. Most people have those. She turned to look at him then, and her expression was the particular expression she showed only rarely. Not guarded and not open, but somewhere in between, the face of someone standing at a real decision. If I said yes, she said slowly, it wouldn't be because of the land case. He looked at her. What would it be because of? She glanced toward the house, where through the window they could see the lamp burning in the kitchen, and the shape of Mrs. Boyle moving past it, and somewhere behind that the room where Hazel's wooden horse was stabled on her windowsill every night without exception. Because I know what it costs a child to lose a household that was starting to feel safe, she said. I watched my sister lose two things she should have been able to keep. I don't want to watch Hazel lose this. It was not the declaration of love that novels described. It was something more specific and more durable than that. A statement of intent from a woman who chose her words the way she chose everything else, with precision, knowing what she was committing to. I'm not a simple situation, she said. Marsh, the Cradle. That's not resolved. I know. And I'm not... She looked at him directly. I'm not going to be managed, Elias. If this is a partnership, it's a real one. I'll give you everything I have for this place, but I won't be given orders in my own house. I wouldn't want you to be. She searched his face for a moment. He had the sense of being read carefully, the way she read the inventory pages, looking for errors, for inconsistencies, for things that would not hold up under pressure. He let her look. He didn't have anything to hide. He was a man who had made mistakes and kept going, which was both his best quality and his most ordinary one. Ask me again in the morning, she said. I want to sleep on it. That's fair. They walked back to the house. Mrs. Boyle had made coffee, which she presented with the complete absence of expression of a woman who had watched them walk back from the snow and had made a series of accurate deductions that she was keeping strictly to herself. Hazel was at the table with a piece of paper, drawing something that might have been a horse or might have been a building. She looked up when they came in and said, You were gone a long time. It's a big property, Elias said. I know, Hazel said. I live here. He did not sleep well. He had not expected to. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind against the north wall and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. Not catastrophically, but in the grinding attrition way that things go wrong when two people with complicated histories try to build something together without the foundation of feeling that was supposed to make such things bearable. Not with the piercing grief of the first year, but with the duller ache of later years, when grief becomes less a wound and more a weather. He thought about the photograph of Catherine Holt, which he had not looked at since October, and was somewhere in the drawer of his nightstand, still folded. He thought about Hazel saying all three of us, and I decided, with the serene authority of someone for whom the decision had already been made by the simple fact of her observation. He got up at 4 a.m. and started the stove because he couldn't sleep, and because the house needed the warmth, and he was standing at the window with coffee when he heard Mara's door. She came into the kitchen in the early dark, already dressed, which meant she hadn't slept well either. She looked at him at the window and she looked at the coffee and she said, Is there enough for two? Yes. She poured herself a cup and stood at the table and looked at the piece of wood with home burned into it, which was still where Hazel had put it, still propped against the lamp. Yes, she said. He turned to look at her. My answer is yes, she said. She was holding the coffee with both hands and her voice was steady in the way things are steady when they have been carefully steadied. But I meant what I said. A real partnership. And I keep the cradle. Yes to both. And when Marsh pushes back, we'll handle it. He looked at her across the kitchen, together this time. She held his gaze for a moment and then she gave a short nod. The kind of nod that meant the decision was made and there was no further point in discussing it. And she sat down at the table and pulled the inventory notebook toward her and opened it to the current page. The review is 8 weeks out, she said. We should talk about Albright. Crane got back to me, Elias said, sitting down across from her. He knows someone who's seen Albright work. Says he's fair but hard on vague documentation. Wants specifics. Good. She turned to a fresh page and picked up her pencil. Then we give him specifics. Outside, the dark was beginning to thin at the eastern edge, the slow gray advance that in Wyoming winter is not dawn, so much as dawn's announcement that it is considering arriving. Inside, the lamp threw its small, reliable light across the table, and the stove was ticking into warmth, and the inventory was open, and they sat down together to build the case for the home they had already, between them, already decided to keep. They married on a Thursday morning in the first week of January at the Clearwater Courthouse, with the county clerk as witness, and Mrs. Boyle standing beside Mara because Mara had no family within 500 miles, and Mrs. Boyle had decided she was coming whether or not she was asked. It was not a ceremony that anyone would have called beautiful. The clerk's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and the radiator in the corner knocked 3 times during the brief exchange of words as though registering its opinion. Elias wore his good coat, which had a fraying left cuff he had not noticed until they were standing in front of the clerk, and could not do anything about it. Mara wore her best dress, which was blue and had been pressed carefully, and still showed the ghost of a fold across the front from being packed in a travel bag too long. Hazel was there. She stood between them and held Elias's hand and watched the proceedings with the solemn attention of someone witnessing an important event, which she was. When the clerk asked if there were any objections and no one said anything, Hazel said, "Good," in a tone of mild satisfaction, which caused Mrs. Boyle to make a sound that was not quite a laugh. Afterward, the 5 of them, Elias, Mara, Hazel, Mrs. Boyle, and Georg, who had come along because Georg went where Mrs. Boyle went and seemed content with this arrangement, went to the Clearwater Hotel dining room for a meal that was slightly better than ordinary and a great deal warmer than outside. Hazel ordered pie with the confidence of someone who understood that special occasions had structural implications for dessert. Mrs. Boyle drank 2 cups of coffee and talked about the weather with Georg in their combined half-English. Elias and Mara sat side by side and ate their meal and spoke little, but not uncomfortably. On the way home, Hazel fell asleep in the wagon between them, tipped against Mara's arm in the unplanned way of children who trust completely before they decide to. Mara sat very still so as not to disturb her, one hand resting on Hazel's shoulder, not dramatically but matter-of-factly, the way you steady something you don't want to fall. Elias drove and didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. The marriage changed the household in ways that were both legal and not. On paper, the Rowan homestead was now a joint claim, Mara's name added to the filing at the land office by a letter Mara herself drafted and Elias signed mailed the following Monday. Their attorney, a man named Prescott in Cheyenne whom Elias had contracted at significant expense after asking Crane for a recommendation, confirmed that the addition was legitimate and would carry weight with Albright at the review. What it changed that had nothing to do with paper was subtler and harder to articulate. The house did not feel different. Their arrangement did not change. Mara kept her room, which she had made functional and spare and entirely her own, and Elias kept his, and they met in the kitchen and at the table and in the daily work of the homestead the same way they always had. But something in the quality of the dailiness shifted, some minor key going slightly major. The way a house sounds different when a window that has been open is finally closed against the weather. He noticed it first in small frictions. They had gotten along well as employer and employee partly because the roles were defined, and now the roles were different, and the definitions were being written in real time, which was harder. She reorganized the root cellar a second time in a way that made better sense to her but meant Elias couldn't find anything for 3 days. He moved tools she had placed carefully without telling her where they went. She had opinions about the cattle rotation that were not wrong, but were different from the way he had always done it. And the conversation that resulted was the first one they had that ended with both of them walking away from the table before it was finished. He found her at the fence line an hour later, checking the posts she had documented in the inventory, crouching in the snow with her notebook, even though it was 17 degrees. "You're right about the rotation," he said. "I was doing it the way my father did it, and I never questioned it." She looked up at him. "You could have said that at the table. I needed an hour to get there." She stood up. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. "I could have been clearer about why I thought it mattered. You were clear. I wasn't listening." A pause. "All right," she said, and then, "I'll tell you when I move things. I'll tell you where I put things. That's all I'm asking. I know." He looked at the fence post she'd been examining. "How's that one?" "Solid. Better than I wrote it up, actually." She made a note. "I underestimated how deep Georg set it. They walked the rest of the line together. It was not reconciliation, because it had not been bad enough to require that word. It was the ordinary calibration of two people learning to share space and authority, which is unglamorous and necessary, and most people underestimate how much work it is until they are doing it. Prescott came from Cheyenne in the third week of January to review the documentation and prepare them for the review. He was a small, precise man in his 50s, with a habit of reading things twice before commenting, and a legal mind that moved more slowly than Mara's, which she had to visibly restrain herself from noting. He sat at the kitchen table with the inventory for 2 hours. Mara sat across from him and answered his questions and handed him additional pages when he needed them. Elias sat to the side and watched, which was the right division of labor, because Prescott's questions were about the documents, and Mara knew the documents better than anyone. At the end of the 2 hours, Prescott set the inventory down and looked at it with the expression of a man who is revising an estimate upward. "This is thorough," he said. "It needs to be," Mara said. "I've handled 4 land reviews in the past 2 years. The documentation in most of them was a list of repairs and a neighbor saying the family seemed hard-working." He tapped the inventory. "This is different in kind. You've dated everything. You've described conditions before and after. You have comparative entries, what the property was in October versus what it is now." He looked at her over his glasses. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father had a water rights dispute," she said. "I was 17. "You won?" "Yes." "I believe it." He pulled a page toward him. "The neighbor statements are strong, Mrs. Boyle's in particular." He looked at Elias. "She's known you how long?" "Since my first winter here." 1882. "Does she like you?" Elias considered. "She respects me. I don't know if that's the same thing." "Better," Prescott said. "Liking is personal. Respect holds up under cross-examination." He made a note. "Cook's attorney, Whitmore, is good. He'll try to characterize the October through December period as the period of record, and argue that improvements made after the petition was signaled are reactive rather than established." He looked at Mara. "Can you counter that?" "The inventory has entries back to the day I arrived," she said. "October 13th. The petition letter wasn't received until November. Everything in those 4 weeks predates any knowledge of the legal challenge." Prescott looked at her. "That's exactly right. Make sure those early entries are separately tabbed and clearly dated." He turned a few pages. "The marriage? When?" "January 3rd, Elias said. "Certificate?" "Here." Mara produced it from the back of the inventory folder. She had filed it there deliberately, which Prescott noted with a slight upward movement of one eyebrow. "Whitmore will argue the marriage was a legal maneuver," Prescott said, "done in response to the petition." "The marriage was a personal decision," Mara said. "I know that. Albright will too, most likely, but Whitmore will say it anyway. What matters is that the household was functioning as a family unit before the marriage. Can you show that?" Elias said, "Hazel." Prescott looked at him. "The child?" "She'll be 6 in March. She can't testify, but she could be there. And anyone who's seen this house since October can speak to what kind of—" He stopped. He was not a man who talked easily about domestic things, about what a household felt like from the inside. "It wasn't a lonely farm with a hired woman," he said finally. "It was a house with a child in it who was getting better." Prescott was quiet for a moment. He looked at Elias, then at Mara, then back at the inventory on the table. Something in his expression settled into something that was not quite warm but was close to it. "Bring the child," he said, dressed neatly, quietly confident. "If she's what you're describing, let Albright see her." "She's 5, Elias said. "I can't guarantee quiet." "No parent can. Just bring her." Well, in the first days of February, the second letter from Harold Fitch arrived, and this time it was addressed not to Mara but to Elias. He read it standing at the kitchen counter while Mara was outside splitting kindling, which she did sometimes when she needed to think, and which he had stopped trying to talk her out of after the second week. The letter was from Marcia's attorney, and it was no longer making noise. It was making a specific legal claim that Mara Ellison, now Mara Rowan, had removed personal property from the Marcia estate in Wichita valued at $40. The lawyer had apparently had someone assess the Cradle, and that failure to return it would result in a formal criminal complaint being filed in Wyoming territory. $40. The Cradle his sister-in-law had built with her own hands, which she had never gotten to use, was worth $40 to a man who had moved another woman's things into his bedroom before his wife was cold. Elias folded the letter and went outside. Mara had a good rhythm going with the axe, which she swung with more efficiency than you would expect from looking at her. She heard him on the porch and looked up. He held out the letter. She read it. She read it twice, in the way Prescott read things. Then she handed it back and picked up the axe and split the next log cleanly down the center. He went to a Wyoming attorney, she said. Yes. That's not cheap, she set the next log. He's angrier than he is smart then. $40 in legal fees to recover a $40 item. What do you want to do? She swung and the log came apart. I want to not think about this until after February 14th. Mara. I know. She sets the axe down and looked at the woodpile. We need to respond, or it looks like avoidance. Can Prescott handle it while he's here? I can ask. Ask him to write a letter acknowledging receipt and stating that the matter is being reviewed by counsel. She picked up the split pieces and stacked them. Buying time isn't cowardice, it's strategy. He's going to keep pushing. I know he is. She looked at the cradle through the kitchen window, visible from where they stood. He can push all he wants. There's nothing left in me that's afraid of him. Elias looked at her standing in the February cold with sawdust on her coat, and the letter in his hand and the axe still moving in small air cuts as she steadied her breathing, and he thought, whatever else this is, she is not a woman who folds. He had known that since the day she climbed off the mail wagon and looked at his fence post and his hammer in that order, but he was still regularly confirmed in it, and he was regularly grateful for it. All right, he said. I'll talk to Prescott. Thank you. She picked up the axe again. Could you send Hazel out? She likes to stack the small pieces. He went inside and told Hazel, who put on her coat with speed that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this invitation, and went out with her hat on sideways in the way she always put her hat on, because the hat had a particular relationship with her head that Elias had long since stopped trying to correct. February 14th arrived. The way dates always arrive when you have been counting toward them, all at once. After the long weeks of preparation, suddenly, just the morning of the thing. They drove into Clearwater in the wagon with Hazel between them and the inventory in a leather satchel Prescott had provided, organized into tabbed sections with an index page in the front. Mrs. Boyle and Georg were already at the courthouse when they arrived. Tom Greer was there, stamping his boots on the steps. Alistair Crane from the feed store stood to the side, talking to a man Elias didn't recognize, who turned out to be a fourth neighbor from the east side of the county. A man named Sutherland, who had come on his own initiative after hearing from Crane what was happening. Elias looked at Sutherland. I don't know you well, he said. No, Sutherland said, but I know Cook. He tried the same thing with the Fletchers 2 years back and he won, and I watched them lose a place they'd worked for 11 years. He shrugged. I had a free day. It was the frontier version of Solidarity, which looked like a man in a worn coat showing up on his own without being asked and not making a speech about it. Harlan Cook was there. Elias saw him for the first time across the courthouse foyer. A big man, broader than his telegram suggested, with the specific bearing of someone who has been prosperous long enough to mistake it for a natural condition. He had 2 attorneys with him. Whitmore was the taller one with the dark coat and the careful posture of a man who measured every room he entered. Elias watched Cook's eyes move across the group assembled in the foyer, the neighbors, the satchel, Hazel, and he saw something shift in Cook's expression, not worry, something more controlled than worry. Recalculation. Mara did not look at Cook at all. She was talking quietly to Prescott, going over something in the index, her finger moving down the page. She had the same focus she brought to the inventory, to the fence line, to Hazel's herb jars. The focus of someone for whom the task in front of her was the only thing that existed right now. Hazel was watching Cook with the frank, evaluative stare of a child who has not yet learned that staring is considered rude. Elias touched her shoulder lightly. She shifted her gaze to Elias, and he gave her a small shake of his head, and she looked at the floor instead, which was close enough. The review room was a plain office with a long table, chairs, and a window that looked out onto the main street of Clearwater. Examiner Albright was already seated when they were shown in, a gray-haired man with a lined face and the unhurried manner of someone who has been doing a job long enough to understand its weight. He nodded to both parties. He did not smile at either of them. He had a copy of Cook's petition in front of him, and a blank notebook beside it. We'll proceed simply, Albright said. Say I've reviewed the petition and the supporting survey. I'll hear from both sides and review any documentation presented. This is not a court. It's an examination. I'll give you my finding in writing within 30 days. He looked at Cook's side of the table. Mr. Whitmore, your client brings the petition. You'll present first. Whitmore presented for 40 minutes. He was smooth in the way of men who have had years to make smoothness look effortless. He walked through the survey, which he had updated with a second assessment from January. He characterized the homestead as underimproved relative to 6 years of filing, cited specific metrics from the Act, argued that the improvements of the past 4 months were reactive and insufficient to establish the long-term stability the Act required. He described the marriage as recent and the household as newly constituted in a way that implied fragility without using the word. He was careful not to say anything that was directly false, which was what made him dangerous. Albright listened and wrote notes and asked 3 questions, all technical, about the survey methodology. Then he looked at Prescott. Prescott stood. He was less smooth than Whitmore and more precise. He laid out the timeline first, the homestead's history, the improvements year by year, the operational continuity through the difficult years after Clara's death. He cited Crane's records from the feed store, which showed consistent purchasing patterns for 6 years. He cited the fence line repair records. He cited the barn. Then he opened the satchel and placed the inventory on the table. This is a comprehensive operational record of the Rowan homestead from October 1888 to the present date, he said. 211 entries, dated, signed, and supported by physical evidence accessible at the property. I'd ask Examiner Albright to note particularly the entries from October 13th through November 10th. He indicated the first tabbed section, which predate the receipt of Mr. Cook's correspondence by 3 weeks, establishing that the improvements in household organization documented here were not reactive to this petition, but constituted the existing condition of the property at the time the petition was filed. Albright picked up the inventory. He turned to the first tab. He began to read. The room was quiet. Whitmore leaned to Cook and said something low. Cook's expression was controlled. He was looking at the thickness of the inventory, the tabs, the organized sections, looking at it the way a man looks at something he did not expect and is recalculating around. Albright read for a long time. He turned pages methodically. He asked Prescott once to clarify the date format used. He read Mrs. Boyle's statement in full. He read Crane's statement. He looked at Sutherland's brief statement, which Sutherland had written himself in a plain workman's hand, and he looked up at Sutherland seated along the wall and gave a small nod that communicated nothing except that he had read it. Then he set the inventory on the table and looked at Mara. Mrs. Rowan, he said. The inventory. This is your work? Yes. You've been on the property since October of last year, October 13th. That's 4 months. Yes. Albright looked at her for a moment. His expression was not warm or cold. It was the expression of a man who has spent a career trying to see situations accurately, which is a different quality from sympathy, but not incompatible with it. In 4 months, he said, you've produced documentation that most homesteaders don't produce in 10 years. Most homesteaders don't have someone trying to take their land, she said. There was a silence. Cook shifted in his chair. Whitmore put his hand on the table in the flat, stabilizing way of an attorney whose client has just been shown to disadvantage. Albright looked at the inventory once more. Then he looked at Hazel, who had been sitting between Elias and Mrs. Boyle with her hands folded in her lap and her hat still slightly sideways, watching the proceedings with the grave interest she brought to anything that seemed important to the adults around her. Is this your daughter? Albright asked Elias. Yes. Hazel. She's 5. Almost 6, Hazel said. She had apparently decided that almost 6 was a relevant distinction in this context. Albright looked at her. Almost 6, he said. My birthday is in March, Hazel said. We're going to have cake. Are you? Albright said. Mara said, I can choose the kind. A brief pause. I'm thinking about it. Something in Albright's face changed, marginally. Not humor exactly. Something that had lived in the same neighborhood as humor, briefly, before returning to the professional baseline. He gathered the inventory and placed it squarely in front of him. He made a final note in his notebook. Then he looked at both tables. I have what I need for my review, he said. I'll make no finding today. Both parties will receive my written determination within 30 days. He looked at Whitmore. I'll say this. The documentation presented by the Rowan homestead is the most comprehensive I've reviewed in 4 years in this role. Whatever else my finding addresses, the question of operational continuity will not be in doubt. He closed his notebook. We're done here. Cook's chair scraped. He stood and his eyes moved across to Elias. Not threatening, not conceding, just the look of a man filing information for later. Elias held it. He was not a man who looked away from that kind of assessment. Then Cook walked out with his attorneys, and the door closed, and the room was just the Rowans and their neighbors and Prescott. Mrs. Boyle exhaled. Tom Greer cracked his knuckles. Sutherland, in the corner, leaned back in his chair. Elias looked at Mara. She was looking at the table where the inventory had been. Her expression was not triumph. She was not someone who let triumph show while the outcome was still 30 days away. But the thing she had been holding for weeks, that careful held-in tension, had eased by some fraction, and he could see it in the set of her jaw, in the slightly different quality of her breathing. Albright said operational continuity won't be in doubt, Prescott said quietly. That's not the finding, but it's what he chose to say before he left. That's not nothing. No, Mara said, it's not nothing. Hazel tugged Elias's sleeve. Is it done? Not quite. But it went well. Can we get something to eat? I'm hungry. You're always hungry. I know, she said, with the serenity of someone who has accepted a fundamental truth about herself. But I'm especially hungry now. They went to the hotel dining room again, the same room as the wedding meal 3 weeks before. It felt like longer than 3 weeks. It felt like a winter's worth of something, which it was. Georg ordered in his combined language, and the waitress nodded with the patience of someone who had learned to understand him. Mrs. Boyle drank coffee. Sutherland, who they had just met that morning, fit into the table with the ease of someone who understood that what he was joining was not a celebration but a meal after hard work, which was a thing he recognized. Mara sat beside Hazel and helped her cut her food without being asked. In the offhand way she did things for Hazel, not making it an event, just doing it because it needed doing. Hazel accepted this with the same offhand naturalness, as though such things had always been this way between them, as though no one had ever had to choose anything. Elias watched them and ate his meal and said little, which was his natural state when things were going as well as they could go. He was not a man who needed to narrate the good moments. He preferred to inhabit them. Prescott left after the meal for the 2 o'clock rail back to Cheyenne. At the door he shook Elias's hand and then Mara's. 30 days, he said to her. I'll write you the same day the finding arrives. Thank you, she said. That inventory, he said. If I'm ever in another land case, I want you working it. She gave him the look she gave when she was not quite smiling, but the not smiling was deliberate. I'm busy, she said. I have a homestead. He laughed, once, genuinely, which might have been the first genuine laugh Elias had heard from him in a month of acquaintance. Then he pulled on his coat and went out into the February street. The ride home was longer than it needed to be because the road was rutted from the morning traffic, and Elias took it carefully. Hazel fell asleep before they were 2 miles out, the same way she had at the wedding, between them, leaning, her hat finally surrendering the fight with gravity and falling into her lap. Mara caught it before it went to the floor of the wagon. She held it in her hand and looked at it for a moment, the small wool hat that had never once sat straight on Hazel's head, and she turned it over in her fingers in the way she handled things that mattered, examining the wear on the brim, the stitching at the crown. I can fix this, she said quietly, so Hazel wouldn't wake. I know, Elias said. The horse pulled them steady through the cold and the ruts. The land opened out around them, pale and wide under the February sky. The homestead still 12 miles north, still standing, still theirs, for 30 more days of uncertainty, and then whatever came after that. It was enough. For now, for tonight, for the ride home through the cold with the child asleep between them and the hat in her hands, it was enough. The 30 days did not pass quietly. Elias had half expected them to, had told himself that the hard part was done, that the review was behind them, that what remained was simply waiting. He had been wrong about that, and he should have known better, because the frontier had spent 6 years teaching him that the interval between doing a thing and knowing whether it worked was usually the most dangerous stretch of ground. The first week after the review was manageable. They fell back into the rhythms of the homestead, which had their own insistence. The animals needed feeding. Regardless of what Albright was writing in Cheyenne, the wood needed splitting, the meals needed making. Hazel had a new project involving a series of small rocks she was arranging into what she described as a town, and the construction of this town occupied her with the seriousness of a genuine civic undertaking. Elias fixed the section of roof over the barn's east stall that had been concerning him since November. Mara began a new section of the inventory documenting the February improvements, because she said it was a habit now, and habits were hard to break. But Elias suspected she was also doing it because the act of documenting meant the homestead was still worth documenting, and she needed that to be true in a form she could hold in her hands. The letter from Fitch arrived on a Wednesday in the second week, and it was the letter that meant Marsh had stopped making noise and started moving. Prescott had sent the holding response in January, and Marsh had apparently taken this as confirmation that Mara could be pressured. The new letter named a specific date, March 1st. Return the Cradle by March 1st or formal charges would be filed in Wyoming territory. March 1st was 13 days away. Mara read the letter at the kitchen table after supper, with Hazel already in bed and the house quiet. She read it and set it down and looked at it for a moment the way you look at something you knew was coming and still didn't want to arrive. "I need to tell you something," she said. Elias waited. The Cradle. She put her hand flat on the table, not on the letter, beside it. Ruth didn't just make it. She made it during the only good year of her marriage, when she thought things were going to be different. She used to say... She stopped. She started again. She used to say that the wood came from a tree that fell in a storm on their property, and that she thought it meant something. That something destructive became something for a new life. She looked at her hand on the table. She lost the baby in February. She was gone herself in April. That man Marsh didn't touch the Cradle once in the 6 years of their marriage. Not once. It sat in the corner of the room they were going to use for the nursery, and he walked past it every day and he never touched it. She looked up. But now he wants it back. Elias was quiet for a moment. "Because you have it," he said. "Not because he wants it, because you do." She looked at him. "Yes. That's not about $40. No. It never was." He turned the letter over on the table so the text faced down. "What would it cost to fight it?" "Legally. More than I have. And Prescott handles land law, not criminal matters." She shook her head. "I've thought about this every way I can think of it. Marsh knows I can't afford to fight him in Kansas, and he's betting I can't fight him here either." "He's betting you're still alone," Elias said. She looked at him. "He sent the first letter before the marriage. He sent Fitch before the marriage." Elias leaned forward slightly. "His information is old. He's still calculating against a woman who's on her own with no resources and no legal standing." He picked up the letter and looked at the law firm's letterhead. "Who do we know in Wyoming territory who handles criminal matters?" Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mrs. Boyle mentioned a man once. In Laramie, she used the word tenacious. That's a good word. She also said he was expensive. So was Prescott." Elias set the letter down. "Write to him tomorrow. Tell him the situation. Tell him we need to know if a Kansas claim has standing in Wyoming and what contesting it would cost." He looked at her. "We don't have to decide anything until we know what we're deciding." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression he had learned to read over the months. A quality of assessment, of measuring the ground before stepping on it. She was measuring him. "You don't have to do this," she said. "The land case is almost settled. You could step back from the Marsh situation, and it wouldn't." Mara. He said it the way he had said it the night she told him about the letter from Fitch the first time. Done discussing. "Write the letter." She wrote it the next morning. Oh. The response from the attorney in Laramie, a man named Calvin Hess, came back in 5 days, which was fast enough to suggest he had considered the question carefully and quickly, the way certain minds work when they find something interesting. His letter was 4 pages, dense with legal reasoning, and cost Elias nothing, because Hess said at the end that he had waived his consultation fee on account of the case presenting a question of territorial jurisdiction he had been wanting to see tested. The substance of what Hess wrote was this: the Cradle had been removed from Kansas, which established that state as the relevant jurisdiction for any theft claim. For Marsh to pursue criminal charges in Wyoming, he would need to demonstrate that the item was concealed in Wyoming with intent to evade Kansas law, a significantly higher bar than simple removal. Furthermore, Hess argued, the item in question had been made by the deceased, Ruth Marsh, whose estate had not been formally settled at the time of removal, meaning the question of ownership was itself unresolved. A theft charge required established ownership. Without a settled estate, there was no established owner. He doesn't actually own it yet, Mara said, reading the letter at the table. She read the relevant section twice. The estate was never formally closed. Ruth died intestate and Marsh never filed the probate properly. Which means what? Which means the cradle belongs to Ruth's estate, not to Marsh. She set the letter down. And Ruth's estate has two potential heirs, Marsh, as the widower, and me, as the surviving sister. The kitchen was very quiet. You could file a counterclaim, Elias said slowly. Hess thinks so. He says the cost would be... She looked at the last page. Significant. But the grounds are real. She looked up. And Marsh would know that. He'd have to know that if I filed, it becomes a real legal contest he can't win cheaply. She turned the letter over in her hands. He's been betting I'd fold because I couldn't afford to fight. If I can show him I can fight, even a little, he might drop it. Men like Marsh. She stopped. She started more carefully. Men who are angry and not smart don't always make rational calculations. But men who are angry and not smart also don't like spending money on losing battles. She folded the letter. If we write back to Hess and authorize him to send a letter to Marsh's attorney, not filing anything, just signaling that we're prepared to contest. Call his bluff. It's not a bluff if we're prepared to follow through, she said. It's a position. Elias looked at the table. He thought about the $40. He thought about a tree that fell in a storm and a woman who made something from it during the one good year of a marriage that went wrong, and how that woman was dead now, and the thing she made was in the corner of his kitchen, and his wife slept in the next room, and his daughter had fallen asleep against that same wife's arm twice in the last month. Authorize Hess, he said. Tell him to send the letter. Albright's finding arrived on March 3rd. Prescott sent it by express post with a cover letter that said, in its entirety, finding enclosed. The Rowan homestead claim is confirmed. Cook's petition is denied. Well done. Elias read this finding standing at the kitchen counter. It was 6 pages of formal language, careful and measured, citing the inventory specifically in 4 separate places. The October entries, the neighbor statements, the operational records, and what Albright called the comprehensive and credible documentation of a functioning family homestead meeting all material requirements of the original filing. The petition was denied on the grounds that the evidence did not support the characterization of the claim as underimproved or insufficiently maintained. He read it twice. Then he went to the door of the kitchen and said, Mara. She came in from the other room. She looked at his face, then at the papers in his hand. She crossed the kitchen and took the finding from him and read it herself, standing, not sitting down, reading the way she read everything, carefully, going back on anything she wanted to be sure of. When she finished, she set it on the table and she stood with her hands flat on it, leaning slightly, looking at the words. Her shoulders dropped about half an inch. That was the whole of it. Half an inch. But he had been watching those shoulders for 5 months, and he knew what they looked like under load, and the half inch was everything. Hazel, she said, she's outside. Mara went to the window and looked out at the yard where Hazel was crouched near the fence in the cold March mud, doing something with the town of rocks she had been constructing for weeks. Some civic emergency, apparently. She was talking to herself while she worked, moving pieces with the focused energy of a small person who does not yet know that some problems are too large to solve by rearranging things carefully enough. Should we tell her? Mara asked. Not today, Elias said. She doesn't know how close it was. I'd like to keep it that way. Mara looked at him. She knew something was happening. She knows something always is. That's different from knowing how bad. Mara looked back out the window at Hazel in the mud, at the wooden horse propped against the fence post while Hazel worked with both hands free, at the crooked hat that had never once in 6 months sat straight on her daughter's head. Her birthday is in 2 weeks, Mara said. I know. I was thinking about the cradle. She turned from the window. I want to put it in her room, not to use. She's too old for it now, and it's not meant for that anyway. But as she stopped. Ruth would have liked Hazel. She liked loud, opinionated, small people. She picked up the finding from the table and straightened it. I think it belongs in a room where a child lives, not in a corner of the kitchen. Elias looked at the cradle. He had looked past it for months, in the way you look past things that carry weight you haven't been invited to share. He looked at it directly now. The cedar, the careful joinery, the place where the wood had been smoothed by someone's hands in a year when they still believed the future was going to hold what they were building toward. Ask Hazel, he said. It's her room. I will. The letter from Calvin Hess to Marcia's attorney went out on March 7th. Elias did not see the contents because Hess had drafted it and Mara had approved it, and neither of them felt he needed to review the legal language, which he was grateful for. What he knew was that it cited the intestate estate, the question of rightful inheritance, and Mara's standing as surviving kin to contest probate in Kansas if necessary. They waited. On March 15th, the day before Hazel's birthday, a letter arrived from Marcia's attorney. 3 sentences. The matter was being withdrawn. No further correspondence would be forthcoming. The item in question was considered relinquished. Mara read it at the kitchen table with Hazel sitting across from her, watching, because Hazel had learned that letters at the kitchen table were sometimes important and had appointed herself a witness to important things. Good news or bad news? Hazel asked. Good, Mara said. How good? Very. Mara folded the letter and set it down. She looked at Hazel. Do you want to know what it's about? Is it about the cradle? Mara looked at her. How do you know about the cradle? I heard you and Papa talking. She said this without guilt, in the manner of someone reporting a fact. I wasn't trying to listen. The walls aren't very thick. No, Mara agreed. They're not. Is someone trying to take it? They were. They're not anymore. Hazel looked at the cradle in the corner. She had the expression she wore when she was working something out, the same expression she'd had at 5, and that had not changed as she moved towards 6. That stillness, that interior processing that happened faster than most people expected from a child her age. It was your sister's, Hazel said. Yes. And she died. Yes. And the man who was married to her wanted to take the thing that was hers. He claimed it was his. Hazel looked at her with a directness that was both very young and very old. But it wasn't. No, Mara said. It wasn't. Hazel appeared to reach a conclusion. I'm glad you kept it, she said, and then, can I have it in my room? Mara was quiet for a moment. I was going to ask you the same thing. Then yes, Hazel said, with the brisk simplicity of someone who saw no further obstacle. We can move it after my birthday. Tomorrow, I want cake. I know, Mara said. I'm making it today. The vanilla kind. I know, Hazel. With the dried cherries on top. I know. You've told me 4 times. Hazel seemed satisfied that this had been sufficiently established and went back to her rocks. Mara looked at the letter on the table for a moment. Then she picked it up and walked to the stove and lifted the lid and dropped it in, and stood for a moment watching it catch. And that was the end of Theodore Marsh and Harold Fitch, and the $40 calculation that had never been about $40. Hazel's birthday was a Saturday, which felt like a grace the calendar had decided to offer. It was not a large celebration. Mrs. Boyle and Georg came, and Tom Greer brought his wife, a cheerful woman named Ida, who brought a jar of blackberry preserves and immediately became Hazel's favorite person in the room, which Hazel announced directly and without concern for anyone else's feelings. The birthday cake was vanilla with dried cherries on top, and it was slightly lopsided because the oven ran hotter on the left side, and Mara had been annoyed by this, and Hazel had said it was the best cake she had ever seen, and she was not wrong, because it was also one of the only birthday cakes she could clearly remember, which was its own kind of truth. After the meal and the cake and the singing, Georg sang in German, which Hazel found fascinating. And after the small gifts, most of which were practical because that was the nature of the frontier, though Ida Greer had brought a hair ribbon in blue that Hazel put on immediately and wore sideways, in keeping with her general approach to headwear. After all of that, the afternoon settled into the particular warmth of a house that is full in the right way. Elias sat on the porch in the cold for a while.
Not because he needed air, but because he needed a moment to stand outside of the inside, to see it from a distance. He could hear them through the wall, Mrs. Boyle's voice low and certain, Georg laughing at something, Hazel's voice pitched high in the way it got when she was excited or explaining something at length. And underneath all of it, moving through the sounds like the thing that made them cohere, Mara's voice, asking Ida something about preserving, and then laughing at the answer. And it was not the polite laugh she used when she was being careful with people. It was the actual one, the one that came with a slight surprised quality, as though she was not yet entirely used to finding things funny. He had heard that laugh maybe a dozen times in 5 months. He had been keeping count without meaning to. He stood on the porch in the March cold, and he thought about what it meant to build something, and how it was almost never the thing you planned. He had planned for Catherine Holt, for a practical arrangement, for someone to run the house and help him through winter. He had gotten something he did not have a word for yet. Something that had taken 5 months of hard work and 2 legal battles, and one 5-year-old who had decided with complete authority that the matter was settled. He thought about Clara. He did that with less frequency now than he had a year ago, which was not betrayal but healing, and he understood the difference even when it still felt like both. Clara would have liked Mara, he thought. Not immediately. Clara had taken her time with people, had watched from a cautious distance before deciding. But eventually, in the way you come to like someone who does what they say and says what they mean and shows up every day without making a production of it, he was not trying to replace Clara. He was not trying to restore what had been lost. He was trying to build what was here, with what was here, which was different and harder and more honest. The door opened behind him and Mara came out with 2 cups of coffee, which had become the signal between them for, "I need a moment outside and so do I." She handed him one and leaned against the post and looked out at the property in the late afternoon light, at the fence line and the barn and the pasture and the creek, still faintly visible at the east edge. "Tom Greer told me something," she said. "What?" He heard from someone in Clearwater that Cooks pulled back from 2 other properties he was looking at, after the review went against him. She held the coffee with both hands. Apparently losing on a case this well documented makes the remaining cases less attractive. Elias looked out at the land. "So we didn't just keep ours?" "Maybe not." She paused. "Sutherland came to the review on his own. So did Crane. They didn't have to." She turned the cup in her hands. People watch what happens to their neighbors. If the Rowan homestead had gone under, that would have been a signal about what Cook could do. That it didn't. She stopped. It matters differently than just our 40 acres. He thought about the Flemings, who Sutherland had mentioned, the family who lost their place 2 years back and had not been there to hear the outcome of this one. He thought about how the work that Mara had done on the inventory, in those cold early mornings at the kitchen table, had been work that protected more than what it was written down to protect. He didn't know how to say that without making it large and important sounding, which would embarrass them both, so he didn't try. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood for a while in the comfortable way of people who have learned that silence between them is not awkward, but inhabited, that they do not need to fill it. "I've been thinking about the spring planting," Mara said after a while. "So have I. I want to expand the kitchen garden. Not by much, but if I can get a better yield on the root vegetables, we can reduce what we spend at Crane's in fall, and I want to try a second variety of squash that Mrs. Boyle says does well here. The south field's better for it, less shade. I was looking at the south field. We'd have to move the fence line about 8 feet. "I know. I measured." He looked at her. "When?" "Last week. I was going to tell you when I had the numbers right." She said it without apology, in the manner of someone who had thought this through and was now reporting conclusions. "The posts are salvageable. It's a half-day's work, maybe less if the ground softens enough." He shook his head once. "You measured the fence line before we even had the Albright finding. The garden plan was separate from the legal situation." "No, it wasn't." She looked at him. There was a beat of silence, and then she said, "No, it wasn't." She looked back out at the property. "I needed to believe we were going to be here in spring, so I planned for spring." He understood that. He understood it more than he could have explained, because it was the same thing he had done every year since Clara died. Kept planting, kept repairing, kept filing records and checking fences and ordering seed, because stopping would have meant admitting that the answer to "what is this all for" might be nothing, and that was not an answer he could live inside.
We'll move the fence line when the ground thaws, he said. I'll pull the stakes I put in. You put stakes in? Just to mark the line. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite disbelief and not quite admiration, but somewhere between them, which was where he often ended up with her. She looked back with the expression that said she saw no particular reason to have done it differently. From inside, Hazel's voice rose suddenly in the specific key of someone who has just won an argument or made a discovery of significance. Both of them turned toward the sound, and then it settled back into the general warmth of the afternoon, and they turned back to the property. The cradle moved to Hazel's room on a Sunday, 3 days after her birthday. Elias carried it. It was lighter than it looked and heavier than he expected, the particular weight of something built carefully from good wood. He set it in the corner of Hazel's room near the window, where the morning light would reach it, which was where Mara said Ruth had always kept it. Hazel stood beside it and looked at it with the serious assessment she brought to things she had decided were important. "It's pretty," she said. "Yes," Mara said. She was standing in the doorway. She had not come fully into the room. Elias noticed this but said nothing. "Will someone sleep in it?" Hazel asked. "Someday, maybe," Mara said. "Not right now." Hazel ran one finger along the top rail, where the wood was smoothest. "I'll take care of it," she said. Not a question. A statement of intention delivered with full authority. "Since your sister can't." The room was quiet. Mara's hand was on the doorframe. Elias could see it from where he was standing. The knuckles, still chapped from winter work, still bearing the faded mark of the stove burn that she had never mentioned. Her hand tightened once on the wood and then released. "Thank you, Hazel," she said. Her voice was even. She kept it even. Hazel seemed satisfied. She turned to the other corner of the room where her rocks were arranged in the ongoing municipal project. "I'm going to build the town near the cradle," she said. "So it's not alone." Elias looked at his daughter, who was already moving rocks with the efficiency of someone who had a plan, who had always had a plan, who had looked at a strange woman arriving on a mail wagon with an awkward bundle in a worn bag and had taken her time, a full 4 days, before deciding, and then decided absolutely and without revision. He thought about all the things children understand that adults complicate, the simple arithmetic of presence and consistency, and someone who shows up every morning and doesn't leave. He moved out of the doorway to let Mara in, and she came in and sat on the edge of Hazel's bed and watched her daughter arrange the town, and Elias stood by the window, and the March light came through at its new spring angle, different from the winter light, less bleak, more direct, like something that had finally decided what it meant. The homestead would need the fence moved in 2 weeks. The kitchen garden would need planning. The cattle would need the spring rotation that Mara had redesigned in November, which had turned out to work better than his father's way, and he had told her so, and she had simply noted it in the margins of her notebook and moved on to the next thing, because she was not a person who needed him to make a ceremony of being right. There were still hard years ahead. He knew that. The land didn't promise anything, and the people who lived on it didn't either. Not really. What they could do was show up and document what they'd done, and sit with the neighbors who came without being asked, and fix the step that was soft before it went through, and make the inventory as accurate and specific as possible, and trust that precision about the real thing was worth more than vagueness about a better one. Hazel had built the town of rocks in a circle around the base of the cradle now. She stood back and looked at it with her hands on her hips, in the way she looked at finished work. "There," she said, "to no one and all of them. Now it belongs here." Outside, the creek ran at the east edge of the property, which had not fully frozen in 6 winters and did not intend to start. The south field waited for the fence stakes Mara had driven into the cold ground when she had needed to believe in spring badly enough to plan for it. The porch step that she had fixed in her first week held steady under whatever foot crossed it, without commentary and without complaint, which was all a repaired thing needed to do. It was enough. It was exactly enough.